Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, members of the academia, distinguished guests, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, I would like to welcome you to our event titled The Ukraine Crisis, Challenges and Perspectives for the European Union. Let me underline that this panel discussion is part of our Jean Monnet program, which is funded with the support of the European Commission. I would now like to ask Professor Papasoteriou, the President of our Institute and Director of the Board, to make a short opening.
Εκ μέρους του Ινστιτου Διεθνών Σχέσεων σας καλωσορίζω στη σημερινή μας εκδήλωση και από εδώ και πέρα θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. I will now turn to English. Let me say that yesterday afternoon, in this very hall, I gave a lecture on British policy in the 19th century. And when I talked about Lord Palmerston's policy, I talked about how he intervened in the Crimea to take control of Sevastopol and the naval base at the time. So geography seems to be destiny. Some areas seem to be of continuous strategic interest, regardless of era. So today, we have with us a distinguished panel with Monica Ekström from the European Commission, representative here in Athens, Mr. Uwe Halbach from the German Institute of International and Security Studies, and Mr. Alexander Tsvetkov, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of the Department of Diplomatic and Consular Service, Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine. And what I'm certain is going to be a very interesting debate about the recent developments that have attracted the attention of the international community in Ukraine, and we are anxiously anticipating future developments in the hope that it will not destabilize European affairs. So I'll give the floor now to Dr. Filis, our Director of Research, to conduct this panel.
Thank you very much, Professor Papasoteriou. The ongoing crisis in Ukraine, with its various dimensions, raises a number of questions with regard to European policy. I would like to share just two of them with Ms. Ekström, Head of Sector, Political Reporting and Policy Analysis of the representation of the European Commission in Greece. First, will we see a reorientation of the EU's priorities, and if so, in what direction? And second, how do you see the EU-Russia strategic relationship evolving, mainly given their economic interdependence? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Filis. If you allow me, I will touch upon your issues in the second part, in the beginning of the panel discussion, and I will make a short presentation to start with. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Institute for International Relations for the invitation, first of all, and for organizing this event. And it's indeed an honor for me to be here, sitting here in this panel. The head of representation of the European Commission, Mr. Panos Karvounis, was unfortunately not able to attend today due to previous engagement. I will try to comment upon some of the challenges of that the Ukrainian crisis has brought about in some of the areas in foreign policy and energy security, etc., as well as some perspectives for the future. We are facing one of the most serious crises in Europe since the end of World War II. What happens these days in Ukraine shows that we cannot take for granted the notion of Europe as we knew it, based on a shared commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Nations' right to choose their own destiny is being challenged in a very serious and dangerous way. Since the Vilnius summit at the end of last year, we have witnessed a massive wave of support in Ukraine for reform and modernization. The Ukrainian people have shown their willingness to live by European values and principles in demonstrations in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. At the same time, we are witnessing economic coercion, threats, and action to instigate protests and instability, which are meant to dissuade the Ukrainian people from taking up new opportunities. The EU will continue to defend the Ukrainian people's right to choose to live by European policies, values, and principles. We cannot accept the logic of the spheres of influence. This would be to ignore the lesson of the last century in Europe. The people in Ukraine, its independence and sovereignty must not become victims of geopolitical zero-sum games. The EU will always support and stand by peoples who are subject to undue pressures. This brings me to the main principle of the Eastern Partnership, which is that we engage on the basis of common values, the respect for and the promotion of human rights and democracy, freedoms, and the rule of law. The EU is, of course, following the political situation in Ukraine very closely and is deeply engaged in finding a peaceful solution to the crisis. Catherine Ashton, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security and Vice President of the Commission, has visited Kiev on multiple occasions. She's also met with the foreign ministers of the US, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine in Geneva in an attempt to de-escalate the crisis and to engage Russia in a dialogue. The Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy, Stefan Füle, is also very engaged in the discussions. The first priority now is to de-escalate the crisis and reach a negotiated and peaceful outcome. The EU will do everything in its power to contribute to a negotiated solution that respects the will of the Ukrainian people. In this respect, the EU calls on all partners to respect the Geneva Statement of the 17th of April, including the disarmament of all illegal groups. The EU stand is firm and united. It insists that any solution on Ukraine must be peaceful. It must involve Ukraine and be based on the full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including the right of Ukraine to decide on its own constitution and political future. The EU has appealed on various occasions to the Russian Federation to call back its troops from the Ukrainian border and to cease any action aimed at destabilizing Ukraine. Any threat or use of force, be it military or economic coercion, against Ukraine or any other country is not acceptable and must be stopped. It's in everybody's interest to avoid further bloodshed and violence on the European continent, which could spiral out of control. It is in our common interest to jointly work towards the establishment of a common area of prosperity, stability, and democracy on the European continent. But such an area can only be established on the basis of the Helsinki OSCE principles and in line with international law. The EU strongly supports the OSCE monitoring mission, which is doing very valuable work on the ground in the eastern regions of Ukraine. And in this respect, the conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council of 14th of April also mentions a possible CSDP mission, a Common Security and Defense Policy mission, to support the police and the rule of law in Ukraine. The EU has strongly condemned Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol. On the 20th of March, the Council condemned the illegal referendum that was held on the 16th of March in clear breach of the Ukrainian constitution. And the European Commission is now working to establish practical parameters of this non-recognition policy, to evaluate the legal consequences of this illegal action and to propose economic, trade, and financial restrictions regarding Crimea for rapid implementation. The EU's reply vis-à-vis Russia is following a three-step approach. As a first step, the Foreign Affairs Council decided on the 3rd of March to suspend the talks with Russia on visa issues and a new EU-Russia agreement. As a second step, in the light of the deteriorating situation, the Foreign Affairs Council decided on 17th of March to introduce sanctions, including asset freeze and visa ban, against 21 individuals responsible for human rights violations, violence, and use of excessive force. And this list included politicians in Crimea and Russia who had publicly supported the deployment of Russian forces in Ukraine. In view of the escalation of the situation, this list has subsequently been amended on the 17th and 28th of April, and now includes sanctions against 48 individuals responsible for human rights violations, violence, and undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The EU has also cancelled the EU-Russia summit, which was planned for June. As a third step, in case Russia continues to destabilize the situation in Ukraine, the EU will decide on more far-reaching consequences, including in a more broad range of economic area trade. The European Commission is working as a matter of priority on the preparation of possible targeted measures, as requested by the European Council. The EU commends the measured response by Ukraine so far. It calls on the Ukrainian authorities to properly investigate all human rights violations and acts of violence. The EU also calls on Ukraine to hold presidential elections with the participation of candidates from all parties and from all different parts of the country to allow for sustainable political stabilization. It also calls on Ukraine to implement far-reaching economic reforms in cooperation with the IMF to ensure economic stabilization. So, what can the EU offer Ukraine? Well, the EU is firmly committed to providing strong political and financial support. On the 21st of March, the EU signed the political chapters of the association agreement with Ukraine, and the EU remains committed to conclude the signature procedure of the remaining chapters, including on trade, of the agreement as soon as possible after the presidential elections on 25th of May. And meanwhile, before that, the EU has also adopted a set of unilateral trade measures that will open the European Union's doors to exports from Ukraine. As regards economic assistance, the Foreign Affairs Council has adopted an aid package consisting of 1.6 billion euro in macro-financial assistance. The crisis in Ukraine has also highlighted the need to increase energy security at EU level and also for Ukraine. The letters sent by President Putin to 18 EU member states illustrates just how important this issue is. And the EU has responded jointly to this letter and agreed in principle on the need for consultations with Russia and Ukraine with a view to ensuring security of supply and transit. And in its letter, President Barroso underlined that energy relations must be based on reciprocity, transparency, fairness, non-discrimination, openness to competition, and continued cooperation to ensure a level playing field. The recent announcement of Gazprom as regards the price that Ukraine has to pay for Russian natural gas underlines once more the importance of diversification of gas suppliers. The European Commission actively supports Ukraine in this regard, for example, by helping it to receive gas from the EU via so-called reverse flows. And this is logical, since the European concept of supply includes also Ukraine. The Ukrainian crisis has also highlighted the need to increase diversification of energy sources at EU level. And the European Commission will therefore, as requested by the European Council, conduct an in-depth study of EU energy security and will present a comprehensive plan for the reduction of EU energy dependence. Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis in Ukraine also leads us to pay close attention to the situation in Moldova and Georgia. And here, the EU is stepping up its political engagement with regard to these two countries. It is envisaged to sign the association agreement, including the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, with these countries already in June. And moreover, visa liberalization with Moldova took effect already on the 28th of April, which was a key achievement. The EU is firmly against the creation of new dividing lines in Europe. Quite on the contrary, the aim is to work with our Eastern European partners and Russia, who is our neighbor, but also a neighbor to our neighbors, towards establishing a common area of prosperity, stability, and democracy on our continent. We have used several occasions to dispel the zero-sum logic and to clarify to Russia that the association agreements with the Eastern European partners will not harm Russian economic interests, Quite on the contrary, Russian business will gain. The crisis in Ukraine has also shown the importance of the Eastern Partnership. 5 years after it started in Prague, and despite the hurdles and challenges, the Eastern Partnership has survived and in many cases flourished. It is an evolving policy which is flexible enough to adapt to different circumstances. The aim of this partnership is simple: to bring our Eastern European neighbors closer to the EU. The objective is to accelerate political association and advancing economic integration between the EU and our Eastern European neighbors. This year, we expect to make important progress. The signature of the political provisions of the association agreement with Ukraine on the 21st of March set the ball in motion. And in June, as I said, we expect the signature of the association agreements with Georgia and Moldova, which will render the political association and economic integration irreversible. These agreements constitute our response to the aspirations of these citizens to live in a democracy, be governed by the rule of law, and enjoy their inherent rights. It is our response to the demand for a prosperous common future. The goal of this partnership is to help our partners deliver on their own ambitions. Ownership of reforms is very important. It is only when a country, its people, and its leadership make the difficult but necessary changes in their political system, their rules, and their mindsets that true democracy can take root. The EU offers tools and expertise. The EU, however, does not export democracy. It offers a helping hand and a comprehensive and genuine partnership. In the future, the EU needs to be better equipped to react to crises, to emerging needs, or rapidly evolving situations. We need to work faster and with more flexibility where needed. This may require some creativity and in adjusting some parts of the European partnership policy, in finding new instruments or making the ones we have work better. One lesson we have learned from the Arab Spring, and we are now relearning in Eastern Europe, is that we need to increase the engagement with broader society. It's essential to help building constituencies for reform and to be able to influence the national decision-making. So we need to intensify our efforts in this direction. Finally, this is by no means the end of the road. As the European Council has stated, the association agreements does not constitute the final goal in the EU-Ukraine relations. The greater the commitment and implementation of joint agreements, the more ambitious the destination. Our Eastern European partners have had their part of a difficult past. They deserve a different future. These partners, especially those with European ambitions, need to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it is for the EU and its member states to rise to that challenge. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your intervention. There are indeed lessons to be learned from Ukraine, and there are other lessons in which we as European Union have received low grades up to now, low scores. And of course, you highlighted the main positions of the EU and the steps that have been taken. And given the fact that EU is divided into different camps with regard to how it should approach Russia, particularly after the 2004 enlargement, I think that we have managed to find some common denominators, even if they are the least common denominators. But still, as we have the elections, the upcoming elections on the 25th of May, which is a big test for all involved parties, what somebody should consider is whether all involved parties have been effective, and in my point of view, effectiveness is a key word in what is happening in Ukraine, It's one thing to take some steps or measures or sanctions, introduce sanctions against Russia, or encourage the interim Ukrainian government to take some actions itself. And effectiveness seems to be, very distant from some of the initiatives that we have taken as European Union and that other parties have also taken. But I assume that we will have plenty of time to discuss all these issues during the questions that will be raised from the audience. So with no further delay, our next speaker, who is an experienced academic, particularly in post-Soviet affairs, and currently a senior associate at the German Institute for International and Security Studies, which is a well-respected think tank throughout Europe, with which we have started to cooperate under our Jean Monnet program, is Professor Holbach. I would also like to raise 2 questions for him that can be answered either in your first intervention or afterwards. Number 1, do we accept Russia's special interests in the post-Soviet space, and to what extent do we accept those interests? And number 2, are we in a position to endure an extended rift in our relations with Moscow? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to this panel on a topic which is one of the, I think, the main topic now in Europe. It's dominating the headlines in Germany and in other European countries. I will answer to your questions partly in my intervention, partly in the discussion. I think analyzing the crisis in Ukraine and its international dimension is actually a difficult task, because analysis is driven, is hunted by events from day to day, if not from hour to hour. In March, the focus of attention was on the Crimea Peninsula and its annexation by Russia. In April, the focus shifted already totally away from Crimea to pro-Russian separatist activities in the eastern part of the country. And in the beginning of May, serious incidents of violence in Odessa further broadened the specter of crisis, which is more and more filled with radicalization. On the level of international policy, we had the Geneva Agreement of April 17th between Kiev, Moscow, United States, and EU. Only 2 days later, the promises of this agreement were already an illusion. Yesterday, the German Foreign Minister Steinmeier asked for another Geneva Accord. We have had another agreement of February 21st, mediated by the so-called Weimar Triangle, on the building of a Ukrainian government of national unity, which was broken within a few hours. We have to distinguish between the crisis in Ukraine, which is complicated enough, even without interventions from the outside, and the international crisis on Ukraine. In its international dimension, this crisis has turned indeed into the most serious conflict between Russia and Western actors since the end of the Cold War. I myself have always been restrained towards any comparison with the Cold War, with the argument that the Cold War was a systemic conflict between geopolitical blocs and ideologies. But the differences between this systemic bloc confrontation and the current crisis seem, however, a little bit diminishing. At least an ideological gap is becoming more and more evident. In Russia, under Putin's third term as president, patriotism and conservatism developed into a categorical ideological confrontation with the West. And this anti-Western patriotism plays quite well for Putin on the short term. It helped to raise his popularity ratings dramatically, from 60% before the Ukrainian crisis to more than 80%. Doing his best to exploit transatlantic differences, Vladimir Putin at the same time has revived a unitary term, the West, as an exact opposite of Russian of Russian values. In Germany, the public is more and more concerned about the perspective of such a new Cold War. According to a recent opinion poll, 72% of respondents express great or very great concern about such a scenario, much more than in the Georgian crisis of 2008, when about 50% of the respondents were concerned. The failure of an adequate European response to the Ukraine crisis and Russia's involvement in it would have manifold consequences. They were already mentioned. It would jeopardize, for instance, the pro-European governments in Moldova and Georgia. It would lead to a protracted instability and conflict in the EU's eastern neighborhood. Accepting this course of events would mean recognition of Putin's claim of an exclusive Russian sphere of influence from Belarus to the Caucasus. After its annexation of the Crimea, Russia obviously does not intend to annex eastern Ukraine, but it wants the West to accept a status of limited sovereignty for the country. Its version of stabilization is a federalized Ukraine with open doors for Russian control. Thus, the Kremlin is obviously pleased by the current Ukrainian leadership loss of control on the eastern parts of the country. Moscow did not show any serious intention to bring the anarchy there to an end. The question, however, is whether any internal or external power is still able to put an end to this anarchy, which is becoming more and more self-driven. The acting president Turchinov has officially declared that Kiev is powerless to resume the control over this part of the country. Most problems in Ukraine result not only from Russia's great power politics. The key to a genuine new beginning and a new political culture in this country lies with its political elite. Some critics in the Western analytical community say that the new elite looks conspicuously like the old elite. The two leading contenders in the May presidential elections are the chocolate king and the gas princess, are two oligarchs. And this contest between Poroshenko and Tymoshenko is hardly promising as a sign of a new beginning in Ukraine, as Eugene Rumer said recently in a Carnegie Center analysis. Some of the key posts in the new government are held by an elite which already served under the old regime. On the other hand, the so-called Maidan revolution underlined that there is a growing constituency in Ukrainian society that wants to build new institutions and is longing for a really new beginning. The remarkable transformation of Poland over the last 20 years has exercised influence on Ukrainians' perceptions of their own shortcomings and the possibilities of reforming a country on a European model. Brussels should follow domestic development in Ukraine maybe more carefully than before in order to prevent a continuation of harmful patterns during back at least to the presidency of Leonid Kuchma, that means at least to the year 1994. The task of reforming Ukraine's dysfunctional economy, helping it combat endemic corruption and build institutions that can provide better governance will cost a lot of money, it will cost billions, maybe last a generation, and require the combined efforts of all the forums, institutions, and the instruments the West possesses: EU, IMF, OSCE, Europe's political foundations, and NGOs. In economic terms, Europe, of course, is much more exposed to the crisis than the United States, which has only minimal foreign trade relations with Russia or Ukraine. But also EU's single member states face different and specific challenges and costs for an adequate response to the Ukraine crisis, especially for standing up to Moscow. France has sided more with Washington on the need for harsher sanctions against Russia than Germany did. but it is engaged in what is currently Europe's biggest arms sale to Russia, in a volume of 1.2 billion. And it is concerned that escalating tension in the East might draw resources away from the EU's southern neighborhood and from the task of recovering from the euro crisis. These fears are shared by EU member states that remain at risk in economic terms, like Greece, Spain, Portugal. The United Kingdom has been vocal on the need for a strong response to Russia's actions in the Ukraine crisis, but it has been careful not to demand sanctions that would damage its standing as a major haven for Russian capital, its financial markets. In contrast to these ambiguous stances, Poland and the 3 Baltic states have left no question where they stand on Ukraine and Russia. The impact of any further destabilization of the situation in Ukraine will hit them first. At the same time, they are also highly dependent on Russian gas. Poland imported more than 50% of its domestic gas consumption from Russia, whereas for the Baltic states, the rate is sometimes close to 100%. In many papers on the Ukrainian crisis, Germany is presented as Europe's pivotal power due to its geographical location, its historic special relationship with Russia, but also with its recently declared ambitions to shift its strategic posture to greater responsibility on the stage of international politics. And one of its closest stages of foreign policy is the EU's eastern neighborhood. Germany's position in the Ukraine crisis and the growing confrontation with Russia is based on 4 main convictions. A political solution as the only one, no military option. International institutions and forums such as OSCE should be involved, especially inclusive forums where Russia is part of. A dialogue with Russia has to be kept up even if Russian actions are not acceptable. Nevertheless, political parties and the German public are divided over how Germany should respond to Moscow's policy in the Ukraine crisis. In Germany, there is the label Russlandversteher, used for politicians and other public figures, especially from the business community, who are insisting on the necessity of dialogue with Russia and respect for the EU's most important neighbor and its interest. They bring into play 6,000 firms doing business in Russia, employing thereby 300,000 people in Germany. External critics have hinted to a refusal by German politicians and the business community, but also parts of the German public, to see how Putin threatens Europe by redrawing borders. The German Russia policy, however, is currently in a process of reframing, with the government adopting a clearly critical stance on Russia in this conflict, albeit in tandem with cautious diplomatic moves. Chancellor Merkel and Foreign Minister Steinmeier are of the opinion that the West had to respond firmly to Russia's violation of a neighbor's territorial integrity, but they are skeptical about the possible imposition of heavy sanctions, of heavy economic sanctions. And the stance of the German public towards Russia has also changed. According to the latest poll by the ARD, the German first television program, the share of Germans who fully trust Russia has reached its lowest point in the post-Cold War period, with only 14% anymore. 70% of the respondents are supportive of economic and financial aid for Ukraine. With regard to economic sanctions against Russia, the public is split. 50% in favor of such measures, 50% against them. For the German Ostpolitik, the Ukraine crisis presents a very special challenge. Why? Well, at the demise of the Soviet Union, at the breaking up of the Soviet Union, and the appearance of 15 newly independent states, Germany pronounced a special relationship with Russia on the one hand. On the other hand, it was the first European country to establish diplomatic relations with the 14 other newly independent states, from the Baltic to Central Asia and to open embassies in all of them, thereby confirming the sovereignty and territorial integrity of these states. And so far, it's a special challenge for Germany when Russia is touching upon the sovereignty and integrity of one of these countries. And Russia is touching upon the sovereignty and territorial integrity in its near abroad, not only in the case of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that you cleared up the picture with regard to the different approaches within Germany as far as Russia is concerned. And let me just add the statements made by 3 ex-chancellors during the crisis and shortly after the Crimean events, when all 3, and of course we know the special relationship between Mr. Putin and Mr. Schroeder, but still there were 3 chancellors who claimed that we should be really careful in how we handle Russia, and they were kind of against the moves that have been taken by the West overall. They were critical on what the West and the direction that the West decided to follow with regard to dealing with Russia. Our last speaker arrived yesterday from Kiev, so he has been for the last several months at the heart of the dramatic events taking place in Ukraine. He has served in several posts around the world as ambassador, and he is now professor of the Department of the Diplomatic and Consular Service at Ukraine's Diplomatic Academy. Of course, there are a number of questions for Professor Tsvetkov. I will only raise one 2-dimensional question, which is, of course, the $1 million question. That is, how will the new landscape take shape in Ukraine, and how difficult is the coexistence of the opposed sides? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Probably I will move questions to our general discussion. And first of all, let me, in my turn, to thank the Institute of International Relations of Pantheon University for the kind invitation to participate at this panel. Institute is well known for the operative strategical analysis of, in particular, Eastern European processes. And I feel that it's my privilege to be here in surrounding high-ranking experts and to discuss, to my mind, one of the most urgent and of principal matter just challenges for the European and international order of our time. Just not to probably repeat, because my colleagues covered a lot of the encircle the problems around international just aspects of the crisis, internal Ukrainian crisis, and involvement of the third party. But probably, Chair, I add some questions to your remarks. If I say, in principle, how could we proceed nowadays with the, how could we consider international law and international agreements, speaking about the just territorial integrity and just who will just answer, are there direct violations of international law if territorial integrity is not just or it's ruined according to the rules? And the second question is how to proceed with non-proliferation regime. If one country which have gotten rid of nuclear status now receives threats from the nuclear state, in fact. The easiest answer, probably we could say that political leaders of the Russian Federation pursuing, to say politely, nostalgic idea to revive already dissolved empire. So they try simply to introduce themselves and to allow themselves to violate international law and their own direct obligations, considering just territorial integrity and agreements with Ukraine. Just to behave themselves on the international arena like in their backyard, and to speak what they wish to speak, in particular in the Security Council of the United Nations. But it would be the easiest way just to say that those are political leaders and their decisions. Probably the reasons and our discussions, it looks like, shows that a lot of this is a multi-sided problem and economical as well. For Ukraine and for Ukrainians, just to shorten my probably expose, we could finalize the main topics of this of the crisis and continuous threat of military aggression from the Russian Federation to probably main points in tripartite dimensions: on national, bilateral with Russia, with Russian Federation, and international levels. On national level, sometimes it's hard to understand how we could just make those definition or separation of understanding between quite often declaration about brotherhood attitude toward Ukraine, and at the same time, in euphorical manner, just to announce that more than 72% of Russians are ready to go fight against Ukraine. Brotherhood and eagerness to fight. What did we do for them so cruel? I wish to say that we have done a lot of the probably not so good things, but probably for ourselves even, for just probably not so quick in our economical developments, etc., but for them. What is the reason of such position? In 1991, we have proclaimed the independence of our state and also the desire to get rid of the nuclear, at that time, the third nuclear potential in the world, to get rid of the nuclear weapons. In favor just to have sovereign democratical development. At the beginning, because we were a part of the Soviet Union economy, it was very hard for us, and we were dependent on Moscow on more than 70% in economical cooperation, in trade relations, etc. And it took us a decade with the just down direction of the development, a decade to build a self-sufficient national economy, not part of the Soviet Union, but now, after a decade, a national self-sufficient economy. And step by step afterwards, we moved toward so-called balanced international trade links. We have now approximately the same level of the trade between the European Union and Moscow, around 30–32% of our foreign trade. And moreover, we have now more dynamic and prospective trends of development with European Union countries than with Moscow. In particular with Greece, we have, to my mind, in the recent period, increase of 140% of our export from your country. And the same with the European Union as a whole. And that makes the first myth in Russia that Ukraine is going out of us, of Russia. Although we are not going anywhere, and we're still neighbors, and we are just for economical cooperation with this country, but on equal base. Just we are sovereign state and they are sovereign state. That is the idea. And the myth number 2, just official proclaimed that they are just defended their compatriots who are discriminated on the territory of Ukraine. Where is the fact of those discrimination? But that topic could be like a special lecture. I just mentioned that we have only one district, Crimea, where Russians have the majority in proportion of the population. But even in this area, to statistic, approximately I could recollect that they have 600 secondary schools, of which only 5 are in full Ukrainian language. Where is the discrimination? But I wish just to probably to put a little bit different side or other side of the medal of this problem. You have seen from the TV news, etc., those shots of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, etc., battlefields, in fact, or just clashes. And by the way, during the even previous presidency, President of Yanukovych, and negotiations with Russians about the price for the gas supply, etc., resources, they were mentioning or just declared ideas that in some future Ukraine could be self-sufficient in just excavating gas deposition in our country. And in particular about shale gas, huge deposition of shale gas exactly with the just coming on the surface, exactly in the areas of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. So the possibility for us in future to develop those areas are tremendous. Just add to this that the most prominent 2 areas of oil and gas debit from the shelf in the Black Sea are near the Crimea. So we have those depositions, strategical matter. And speaking about Odessa events, one of the also just those economical vision of this area, Odessa is the most important transport crossroads for Ukraine and in general in the south of our country. Just look on this, in addition to official just shots and explanations. And on to move to the bilateral level, it's better just to cite probably one of the definitions from the journalist in Ukraine. They compare those developments and relations in between our countries, like, or they compare this to robbery during the fire. Or for me, it's also, I could mention another definition, this is a shooting into the back. Because we have a basic agreement with the Russian Federation about friendship, partnership, and cooperation of 1997. We have a Budapest Memorandum on security assurances to Ukraine, speaking about our coming to the NPT regime, non-proliferation regime. We have agreement on state border with Russia of 2010, even demarcation of the border. And all main articles from all those documents, international law documents, ratified even by the parliaments in both countries. Main articles of those agreements say that territorial how do you call it? Integrity, territorial integrity, sorry, is just not even discussed, is just guaranteed, that all interests are included, that in case of some threats to those issues, immediate consultations in between sides should be introduced. And what we have? No guarantees, no support, and no desire and even reaction on the request for the consultations. And just on international level, we have gained also several lessons. The main probably negative, during the latest presidency, Ukraine has declared the course of non-membership in any military blocs. And we have received just aggression into the Crimea and annexation of a great part of our territory and threatening for the further escalation of the just aggression. So as a result, probably just promising result, we have now such figures like 70%, according to the polls, 70% of population in favor of national unity. 60, slightly more even, 60% in favor of integration with the European Union. And 40% just to join NATO. Even the last figure, we could say that a decade ago, only 10% of political elite have spoken about the entering just seriously, firmly about NATO. Now 40% of population firmly to the NATO. And definitely we wish as a country, as a population, as a general idea, we do not wish to be a gray zone in between. Not to be a sandwich in the center of Europe, in between the European Union and Russia. So that is a kind of the one lessons and some results of it. And the second lesson, or just reality, Ukraine was and still is heard by the world. And we definitely receive a lot of the moral, physical, financial, assistance, support from international community. But I think that such kind of the cooperation and assistance still need more. It was mentioned that in nearest future, in current prospectively future, in fact in 2 decades, 20 days, we will have election campaign, president election in Ukraine. And we consider this event as very much important for the country and for the organization and of all political and changes, just starting to answer on your question, just for the new political order in Ukraine. The nomination of the main figure legitimizes all the processes. And in longer perspective, we definitely need to use all our possibilities and international support to increase or just for the economical developments. In case of the economical developments with the Southeast territories, everything would be simply to define and to solve. We could show a positive example for Russian side also to develop economically, not fighting. But for these purposes, we should stop aggression now and consider what to do and how to do later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that your points were crystal clear. And now I will pass the floor to the audience for questions, observations, positions. whatever you may want. Let me begin with Professor Roussos, who has asked to speak. It's videotaped, so you need to use the microphone.
Thank you. Well, all the talks were very enlightening, and I would like to thank the speakers and the Institute for this wonderful event. First of all, I would like to make two observations, very, very brief, and I would like the speakers to respond if possible. The first observation, the first thing that I would like to say is that we now understand that what we call the intervention of the international community in the form of military interventions of the US and its allies in internal affairs of states or internal conflicts or is not anymore here. It's not present anymore. And this is a new, actually, development in the international politics, in how we understand international politics now. I mean, in the case of Syria and in the case of Ukraine, I don't think that anybody in his or her senses would anticipate such a military intervention. So this is one thing. So are we going to another world, in another phase of the post-Cold War era, that we don't have any military interventions with or without the assent of the UN, and how this would actually influence the situation in Ukraine? The second observation that I would like to make is that what we see in Europe now is a German hegemony, an actual German hegemony, without a hegemonic strategy. That is, Germany is destroying its allies, especially the southern allies, and then this has an enormous impact on the political power of the EU. So, do you think that also this let's say factor in a way influenced the European Union inability to play a role? This is to play a role in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
We will receive two more questions, and then we will end with the first round and get into the second round of questions. So, the lady here on your right hand.
I'd like to ask, do you think that this intervention, this intervention in Crimea is able to fire up other controversial issues between other neighbors, apart from Russia's, such as Greece and other controversial areas that have such problems?
And the last one by the gentleman in front.
Do you mind if I make 4 questions? Wait, it's to each of you? It's very... Yes, to each of you. If you... One question to each one. No. One, sorry, yes, to each. Yes. Well, first to Mr. Tsyatskov, I would like to ask, what exactly happened to Mr. Yanukovych? I mean, he met with Mr. The foreign affairs from Poland, Germany, and France, right? And then he left to Kharkov, and then we're hearing from the presidency that he will make the constitution of 2004, okay? And then we're hearing that there is an attempt against him to, there was an attempt to kill him, as I heard, okay. The other question to Mrs. Ekstrom, why so much hurry for EU to sign an association agreement with a government that has been elected? Why EU didn't wait for 25th of May so as to have a government and then to sign a new agreement with Ukraine. To Mr. Philis, I would like to ask again about South Stream project, if it will continue to construct it. Okay, and to Mr. Holbach, I would like to ask what about Mr. Putin's, he said in 2007 in München that Kosovo is not a unique case. And now I believe he gave to us an answer what he did mean in 2007 in München.
Okay, thank you. Shall we start from the lady and then get in the same order to give the answers?
Well, first of all, with regard to the last question, the EU made this specific choice in this very specific case to sign the political agreements of the association agreements. It's a sign of support to the Ukrainian government. And the EU considers that it has legitimacy. It has received a motion of support in Parliament. Therefore, it has support. So it's a piecemeal approach, as often in the EU, to start with a political agreement, to send a strong message of political support, and then continue after the presidential elections with the remaining trade chapters. So I hope that is clear enough.
Well, to the question directly to me, Kosovo, not a unique case, of course. Russia has made many statements like that, which are hinting on double standards in Western politics. Of course, there are double standards. We know about the dispute about Kosovo and so on as an example for double standards. But at the other side, you have to look how Russia is producing double standards, dramatical double standards, for instance, in coping with separatism. Look like Russia has its own separatist challenge, cope with its own separatist challenge in 2 wars in Chechnya, which destroyed a society and a country in the northern Caucasus with utmost military intervention. Now it's saying that Ουκρανι is producing blood in the eastern parts because some Ukrainian troops are responding to this challenge in Donetsk and so on. That is a double standard. Yeah? Russia has forbidden any criticism for European criticism with regards to its coping with a problem in Chechnya, with hinting to its territorial integrity, to its right to defend its territorial integrity. But on the other side, it is using separatist conflicts in its near abroad against these near abroads, in the case of Georgia, in the case of Moldova. So there is an incredible double standard in coping with separatism as a challenge for the international community, as a challenge for states. And I see the same double standards with regard to the notion of sovereignty. Russia, together with China and other other states, are right to say that sovereignty is a holy thing, cannot be touched by interventionism under for instance under the topic of responsibility to protect or so. But if it comes to its near abroad, it has a very limited notion of sovereignty. It does not give Georgia the sovereignty for choosing to enter European, for choosing a Euro-Atlantic vector of its policy. So Russia is right if it says the West is producing double standards, but it is self-producing, crying double standards. And another question to the interventionism, I think there is a military interventionism is not on the table, especially not on the European side. if there is any kind of monitoring, if there is any kind of which has a touch of military activism, it is in the framework of OSCE. It should be in the framework of OSCE, and should be, of course, with the consent of Russia, with a cooperation with Russia. I don't see that there is on the European side that there is a military intervention on the way.
He spoke about the U.S. particularly, not.
Yes. Yes, of course. The U.S. is another.
And by the way, let me be a bit more provocative, because there was a second question raised by Professor Roussos concerning Germany's hegemony within Europe, and whether Germany has a strategy apart from fiscal accommodation. Let me put it.
Well, we can discuss about hegemony in Germany's hegemony in Europe. I remember the Polish foreign minister, who said Germany should do more with regard to leadership. It is too restrained. It should show more leadership. If it comes from Poland, a country which had suffered from Nazi invasion and so on. It does not speak. It does not show that Germany is such a hegemonic player in the EU, as you said in your question. But I'm not a specialist for EU policy and for Germany's EU. But I think Germany is an actor within the framework of EU, which has not its very own agenda. It is acting in the framework of this, also in the Ukrainian crisis.
Okay.
Chair, could I probably add to the answer to the last question, speaking about that we could easily see the dynamics and change in the position of Germany in particular, and the latest initiative about Geneva II. It shows also just that they are paying more and more attention and developing their position. And speaking about international intervention, definitely this is a mandate should be of the Security Council and United Nations. And Security Council, in fact, paralyzed their meetings with the 15 members, and one permanent member with the veto possibility just cancel 14 members against just intervention, but one member just with the right for veto stopped the whole process. You know that some meetings, at the beginning, meetings of the Security Council was proposed and on request of Ukraine, because on security issues and protecting our country. But the latest was requested by the Russian Federation, and again there were 1 against 14. So either some bluffing or to show that international just mechanisms are not working from the point of view, from their point of view. But still, it's definitely the main mechanism to solve the problems. And in case of international observance, the latest Ukrainian initiative, the more observers, in particular for election of the president on the 25th of May, the better. So we are open to any kind from any side of the official just observers to see about the developments and the mechanisms of those elections. The question was also, not for me, but probably I will answer, other nations and Crimea developments. Definitely there is a dynamic here as well, because, you know, the first just aggression and the referendum which was in Crimea, it was under the just guards of the military, we call it green soldiers or something, without just emblems to the national, but armed people. And this referendum was with the absence of the huge proportion of people. I'm not speaking about Ukrainian but we consider that 4 to 100,000 Ukrainians are on the territory of Crimea, but 300,000, for example, Crimean Tatars, they mostly not participated. And now with the Russian authorities just introduced measures not to allow the leaders of Crimean Tatars to visit their people in Crimea. So definitely that could, in some kind of, in some period of time, of course, to include other just states to speak about specific violations of the rights of the national minorities in this area. And question to me about the I wish to say, escaping campaign of President Yanukovych. No, this is more and more nowadays is more visible because during the negotiations with the international intermediaries, there were some decisions, but he signed this, but not signed the legislation bill about the just changing to the constitution, because we are transforming from the pure president, just democracy republic, to parliament president republic and democracy. And he did not sign this bill, and according to the camera films nowadays, just was involved in 3 days escaping from his headquarters. And now, unfortunately, we only now discover the fact that not only he and his just probably big, who knows what he has taken with him, but according to some estimations, almost 3/4 of our budget sum of money escaped from Ukrainian territory in this period of 3 days. And it looks like those money now introduced just to hit the process in the southeastern territories. This is amount about $32 billion. It's including just, that is probably explanation why our gold deposition so shortened now. Thanks.
$32 billion is approximately the amount of money that Ukraine will need for the next 2 years to cover its expenses. Dr. Holbach, I would like to add something before we move to the next round of questions.
Yes, I had an addition to this question about the impact of Crimea on other states. I think the Crimea case had an impact, a deep impact on the, especially on the post-Soviet space, in parts of this post-Soviet space where there are open secessionist conflicts, open so-called frozen conflicts. And you see that the response of the states were very different. Take, for instance, the Southern Caucasus, where we have the most conflicts of these frozen conflicts, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. We had very different responses to this crisis, to the Ukrainian crisis and Russia's role in the Ukrainian crisis in Georgia on the one hand and in Armenia on the other hand. In Georgia and also in Azerbaijan, there was a clear commitment to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the statement that Russia violated this integrity, whereas Armenia was a country which was most on the side of Russia. Also in this UN, in this United Nations Abstimmung, United Nations on Ukraine, on the resolution which Ukraine brought in. There were 100 states on the side of Ukraine, only 11 states on the side of Russia, and Armenia was among them, because Armenia has its own interest with regard to the Karabakh conflict. For Armenia, Karabakh is its own Crimea, it had total different interest with this regard than Azerbaijan. Insofar, it has the Crimea case has again revived the discussion on the legitimacy of secessionism in this space.
Let me just stress that there have been signed two agreements, one on the 21st of February and one on the 17th of April. None of them has been implemented, and it is very unfortunate and discouraging the fact that no side has respected not a single paragraph, if not a single sentence of these agreements. This is very, very discouraging, and it is everybody who has put his signature on them to blame and to hold responsible for this development that, in my point of view, creates a very negative precedent. Because when we have the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, for instance, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, or Mr. Kerry putting their signatures in agreements that cannot and are not implemented in practice, this is a precedent that we should take into consideration, because if the big countries cannot impose their will and cannot, agree and find some common denominators and implement them, and if they do not feel responsible for holding up their signatures, then something is in the wrong direction. So let me come to the audience. Once again, this is the second and the last round of questions. We have something like 15 minutes before we complete our session. So if you could please raise your hands. It's okay. We have 3 questions, 4 to 5. Okay, the gentleman here in front. Eleni, the gentleman in front. Please be as short as possible to give plenty of time to the rest of the audience to raise their questions.
Thank you, the panel, and congratulations for this briefing for us. I would just like to ask the following question. Everything to me seems like was expected to happen. I mean, all these difficult situations could probably have been preempted if appropriate measures could have been taken by the European Union cooperation. And I'm speaking like that as a believer to the European Union aspirations. And in that direction, I hope in the future could be more cooperation amongst the nations to strengthen the European Union ability to cope with such problems. But then again, I wonder, nobody was expecting this to happen. I mean, to me, it looks like evident and like expected. Thank you.
The gentleman there, and then Demosthenes. Yeah, the gentleman there.
Hello, again, congratulations, and thank you for this meeting. I will be brief. My question is, I have finished the Department of Turkish and Modern Asian Studies, and I am trying to deepen my knowledge regarding the Black Sea. And I have noticed that seeing the history of Russia, Russia is doing what is expected from Russia. The diplomacy of Russia in the lands of Crimea in this period is expected. I would say that it is very naive to even think that the diplomacy of Europe would be surprised that Russia would intervene in such a way. I would like to ask what makes, even though I aspire the European Union, what makes the referendum illegal? Is it not right when the majority of a population of a given land asks to live under a different regime? Is it not this legal? What is it that makes it illegal? Does someone has another say, and we put this as an illegal? And earlier we mentioned about the sanctions, and we hear about the sanctions in the television, and we listen a lot. And in practice, the sanctions are nothing than personal sanctions against some persons, not against a country. So what is the meaning of this? Is this a policy for the inside of those countries, so for the voters of the given governments, or does it has further meaning? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Dimopoulos.
Thank you. Mr. We'd like to thank you all for this very nice work and brief. Also, we'd like to thank the Institute for making so many informative sessions during this year. So I would like to make actually two questions, if that's okay. One is we had several speakers spoken about the upcoming elections at the end of May. What if Eastern Ukrainians simply don't go to vote, or actually vote unanimously or in an overwhelming majority against the winner? So they have actually stated a different will against what will actually would be the outcome. So is the elections binding them? What's the status? What might happen then? And the second question, actually the most important one, is we have seen that the United States of America and the European Union, ever since the end of the Cold War, they have left pragmatism and realism and have tended to a self-fulfilling foreign policy, that they believe that they are the global patrol and they can help through democracy, establish better regimes, etc., etc. And they're actually condemning other players like Russia or China for using like 19th century politics, etc., which it's a bit worrying, because actually it was the US and the European Union which were excelling in geopolitics and pragmatism. And we have seen that their foreign policy and how they act completely lacks that fact. Now maybe it's time for the US and the European Union to start rethinking how they are acting and how their foreign policy is formulated. Maybe that would be for their own benefit, firstly, and then for the rest of the world. Thank you.
If I may, of course, I must underline that since 2008, I think that there is a totally different trend with regard to US foreign policy, with the one you are describing. But we will solve that in... Okay, so I think there are two more questions. Okay, the gentleman next to Mr. Dimopoulos.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. When the Russian president asked the Russian Duma about permission to intervene in Ukraine, he said that he will protect every Russian-speaking person in every country in the eastern, in Eurasia. So we said previously that the events are very fast. Firstly, we had the annexation of Crimea, and now we have the conflict in Eastern Europe. What about Moldova? 1 month, 2 weeks before maybe, the Russian president said that Transnistrians have to have their own rights, and etc., etc. Do you fear that there is a Russian expansionism, and is EU a deterrent about that? Are the sanctions effective? And maybe, do we need a EU military to use as a deterrent to every other nation or whatever? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I see no other hands. Okay, so the floor is yours. Try to be short in answering some very interesting questions. We will start with the ambassador.
Thank you. Just questions about a referendum or a kind of referendum or possibility. You see, two questions. In our constitution, there are no provisions of such kind of referendum, but nothing wrong just to make a kind of the plebiscite or etc. on questions which could be of interest for population. And even more, the latest proposal is to use President of Ukraine election on 25th of May and to add additional questions about what kind of new political order and decentralization, and to introducing more power to the regions could be introduced. So the question is probably to use this opportunity, because people are going to the poll centers, and to answer on those questions, to make a kind of referendum which our legislations allowed. But we never just agree with the fact that a kind of the polls or referendum could be under the control of the armed people, military men, who knows coming from which areas. So that is why now this anti-terroristical just operation. We try to close the border with Transnistria as well, and just to control the border, because it was not so closed beforehand from the eastern territories. So try to control, and in case of people could introduce their will freely, then a kind of such referendum will be introduced in Ukraine, in addition to those questions which will be added on 25th of May. So it's probably the main question to me. No?
I think there was another one on what's going to happen after the elections if the eastern provinces decide, or the majority of them, if there is any Russian oriented majority, if they decide not to participate in the elections in order not to legitimize the result of them.
Now, the main question now, just to give opportunity for the majority of people to introduce their will freely. And until now, in the clashing situations, it's impossible to do. So that's why it's an additional reason to make those just elections of the president, and with the and introduces new legislation to pass through parliament to organize such referendum. Referendum couldn't be organized just by chance. It should be some period of preparatory work, and to inform a population about what kind of questions should be introduced. In case, so any kind of results will be open to the public and with the participation of the international observers. But there should be some kind of specific peaceful situation in those areas. So that is.
Okay, that's good.
Well, these are very interesting and very difficult questions that you are posing, actually. First of all, if this situation could have been foreseen, and whether the EU has a naive thinking of the world and of this sphere of Europe, I don't think so. But I think that in practical terms, it would have been very difficult to take any preemptive measures to, for example, to prevent the annexation of Crimea. I don't see how the EU could have done anything in practical terms. Of course, you could always say that from a diplomatic point of view, the EU could have done more. But that is another question. And of course, more cooperation is needed, and that will be, now hopefully this conflict will not escalate beyond control, but that will be one of the lessons for the future. About the referendum, why the EU thinks it's illegal, I fully subscribe to the analysis made by the ambassador, because there are certain modalities that have to be fulfilled. It's not only the result that counts, but any sovereign state has the right to organize a referenda on its territory, but it has to be in accordance with its own constitution and cannot be organized by others, or even instigated by others, and it has to follow certain modalities, and certainly not be controlled by armed forces. As regards the sanctions, I know there has been a lot of discussion why the EU has not gone further, and also the US, and why so far there's only been personal sanctions. But this is a very difficult balance, for everyone. And as the other speakers have highlighted, the EU is composed by 28 member states with different traditions, different history, and different views on this, and different views on Russia. So first of all, it's not so easy to find a consensus on this, and this is a matter of fact. It's even difficult within one member state. We see that the German opinion is divided on this. So it is a difficult subject. And also, you cannot, the EU could not, or the US for that matter, start by imposing trade sanctions. For example, you have to have something in case the situation escalates. And that is one of the reasons there has been this progressive approach. And also the sanctions that the EU has imposed, it's not meant to be a penalty vis-à-vis Russia. It's supposed to be a means to to reach the goal, which is to have a negotiated solution on Ukraine. So all these factors makes it difficult, but there are preparations to escalate the sanctions if necessary. So it's not that the EU has finished on this yet.
Thank you.
Yes, I answer the rest of the questions which were not touched by, which were still open. At first, was it expected to happen? Of course, that is a question which was asked very often in the last weeks. And the EU was sometimes criticized for underestimating this competition of integration in the eastern neighborhood between EU and Russia. We know that Russia has its own ambitions of integration in the framework of a Eurasian Union and already existing custom union, and that it is promoting this project, and that Putin has often said that any kind of Eurasian integration is totally incomplete without Ukraine as a pivotal state in this context. And then is the question: did we misread these messages? But we have to see that the Eurasian narrative on the Russian side has dramatically changed. There was a shift in this Eurasian narrative. In his first statements on this project in 2011, in the end of 2011, Putin presented a symphony of integration between Europe and Eurasia as in the framework of you can do both in addressing Ukraine without saying Ukraine, is that there can be synergy effects between customs union and association processes with the EU. There is a symphony of integration from in a space from Lisbon from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and this has changed more and more, especially in 2012 and 2013, to a categorical either-or. Glazev in its communication with Ukraine said it: "Don't go the wrong way. It will be a catastrophe for you. It will be catastrophical for you." There was a very categorical either-or, either the Western way or the Eurasian way, and Russia used every kind of leverage to bring this message to the candidates for this Eurasian invitation. Moldova, Ukraine, Armenia, leverage of toll, leverage of this kind that Russia blocked certain products from the other countries because they are unhealthy also. Every leverage was used to bring this message to the neighbors. Don't go the wrong way. In so far, maybe we underestimated this message, that this change of narrative from you can do both, you can have the integration to the custom union, you can have it in the other direction, to this categorical either or. Another question, Moldova. I think Moldova is one of the most exposed countries in this crisis because it is involved in an unresolved separatist conflict, Transnistria. There is a military presence, Russian military presence in Transnistria. Moldova is very dependent on migration, labor migration to Russia. Economically highly dependent on Russia, also on Russian energy, and it has a government which is very like in Georgia, very Euro-Atlantic oriented with a Euro-Atlantic vector, and all that together makes Moldova a front state in this crisis. And I think we have to wait what will happen around Transnistria and Moldova in the next weeks.
Thank you very much. Let me just say that the Eurasia Union, the Russian-inspired Eurasia Union, will be totally different if Ukraine is not part of it. So Ukraine is a key state. Indeed, it has been called in the past by Zbigniew Brzezinski a pivotal state, and as far as the Eurasian Union is concerned, it is another Eurasia Union with and another one without Ukraine. So I would like to thank all of our three distinguished speakers for shedding light on... Yes?
Sorry to intervene, but just to finalize the last answer and your addition. I just wish to underline that it's possible for any country to plan any activities and probably to see their future. But just the fact that Ukraine is a sovereign state with more than 46 million of population, 23 years of independent statehood, we have now appeared a new generation which has grown up without even memory about previous Soviet period, and no chain of command from another capital could be influential for my country. That is the essence. Thanks.
Okay, with this statement, I would like to thank all of you for shedding light on a very challenging and confusing ongoing topic. And before we conclude, I would like to stress that the administration of our institute has decided to proceed with analyzing as many aspects as possible vis-à-vis the crisis in Ukraine. And our main focus will continue to be Europe. So in the coming weeks, we will host an event on the effect of recent developments on Europe's security of supply, where I'm going to answer your question concerning South Stream, as today I'm moderating the discussion. I'm not a panelist. In the meantime, we are planning to conclude the 3 studies conducted by the Russian Eurasia unit, which is part of the Institute, and those studies will be presented shortly. So, as you realize, in the next couple of months, we will be very busy doing research, writing analysis, and hosting you in panel discussions and similar events under the auspices of and with the support of the European Commission. So once again, thank you all for being with us this evening. And I wish you the best, as I wish, of course, the best for Ukraine and its people. Thank you.